have the privilege of chatting to Bronwyn Williams again to look at 3 key trends for cities in 2022. And as always, I promise you will learn a great deal from this vibrant conversation. Bronwyn, welcome. It's great to have you back on the show. Let's start with your first key trend, and that is called HaHa cities. What is that, and how do you see it playing out?
So HaHa cities is a term that I have coined in order to collect a bunch of trends that we see going on in the world at the moment. And what a HaHa is actually quite a medieval term. And what happened was wealthy landowners would dig a ditch around their property rather than putting up a wall, which would spoil the view, in order to keep, inconvenient peasants and poor people from, straying onto their beautiful properties. That's a HaHa. So it's an upside down kind of a wall. It's a hole, it's a ditch. It's almost like a moat, but without water inside it. And why I think that's a particularly useful sort of frame to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing is a lot of the segregation and separation that we're seeing taking place in cities is being done in an invisible sort of a way. So it's these invisible walls that are being built and often sold as being quite progressive projects, but are really in effect creating, as South Africans would know them, people that have grown up with our very dark history in this country, as very similar to what happened with spatial planning and townships, which essentially segregated people and communities based on race or based on socioeconomic class into different areas that were very difficult to cross into. Now, in the South African context, we don't obviously have actual checkpoints and walls, but a lot of those rules were actually put in place under the guise of progress, and also not being very explicit about building those walls. And one of the things we're definitely seeing is this idea of 15-minute cities is also, again, being sold as a very sort of progressive, very climate conscious and all the rest of it. I'm not diminishing that at all. The idea of being able to use less motorized transport does, of course, have an impact on the amount of carbon that a city puts out. But in effect, when you remove motorized transport from your cities, you are creating a spatial inequality in that people that live in wealthier areas of very developed cities within that 15-minute walking radius have obviously access to that 15-minute sort of circumference of that very good piece of real estate. And in effect, what it does is it creates these barriers in terms of cost and in terms of inconvenience to keep outsiders out of your communities. Now, this is a concept that, of course, city planners have known for a very, very long time. Everything from like NIMBYism, which is like not in my backyard. And I think there's a case now in the United States where some, again, quite progressive community bodies, at least that's how they position themselves, have blocked the building of high-density residential apartments because it was going to obscure the view of their dog park. It was going to cast a shadow onto their dog park. And we see a lot of these sorts of things, sort of invisible boundaries that separate certain communities from each other. I mean, this is not a new trend. We all know about redlining, which is very, very similar, but that's more in the financial space where essentially like banking algorithms, even if that algorithm is a person that's making that discretionary choice, sort of judge people based on where they live and then assign a higher credit risk to those people. These are sort of invisible barriers that we see popping up everywhere. It also plays out in the sort of actual transport sphere, where we have very big bodies like the European Union that are now putting, again, in the guise of climate and all the rest of it, now putting in rules and saying that they're going to be increasing taxes on transport, particularly flights and also sea-bound transport routes and vehicles. And what we really see there is that they've also sort of exempted private jets and yachts from a lot of these taxes and a lot of these regulations, which can also be seen if you are of the slightly more cynical or skeptical mindset as essentially kind of pricing or inconveniencing out of luxury travel destinations the mass market. It is something that we see quite a lot of. I think it's an interesting trend to follow, and we start to interrogate perhaps the unintended consequences, because a lot of what I'm saying can be taken very, very cynically, but also a lot of these things happen accidentally. People don't think of the human consequences of their very utopian projects. And this, of course, is one of those classic curses of any sort of city planning, utopian society building ideas, in that quite often our best laid plans have quite dark consequences when we start getting into them.
So from our previous conversation about private cities to now invisibly walled gardens, do you see private cities as still a big theme?
Absolutely. Private cities is something that I've definitely spoken about on this show and many other places before. Private cities is one of those continuing trends, and we kind of see it branching into various different aspects. So the one aspect would be this idea of actually founding a private city. There are a lot of utopian, again, projects coming out, particularly between like really rich people who are talking about buying up land or moving to a different location and actually setting up like utopian projects. And they are generally tend to be in the vein of very planned in terms of spatial sort of demographics and in terms of how buildings are going to be put out, and very, very top down, which is quite ironic because a lot of these private city projects are being run by people who consider themselves to be quite libertarian and quite part of this sort of decentralized movement. But they're planning these very planned city projects. But they're taking place not just on the physical space, but also in the virtual space. So you're also finding, again, it does tend to be largely wealthy Americans, a lot of the Silicon Valley crowd, a lot of the people that have attended conferences like HaHa, all the sort of people that are attracted to these utopian ideas. And they're also starting to build virtual cities, as they call them. And one of the sort of bigger projects in that space is a project called Praxis. Don't Google them. You're unlikely to find the right website. But if you go onto Twitter or go onto their Discord, you'll be able to find this community, which doesn't even really have a website. They build themselves as like this sort of virtual decentralized city, but they are trying to plan the sort of, again, utopian social order, but seeing that cities in their worldview, at least, could actually start from the virtual realm first. So in other words, start with the money and the politics and then find the land to govern. So we see the sort of top down and bottom up sort of movements towards these private cities that will be governed largely by code or by at least codified consensus, even if not by consent, but not by governments per se. So it's quite a different look at democracy and quite a different look at how we can actually govern society in the physical and in the virtual realm.
This all sounds to me very much in line with a global trend, and that is called the Metaverse.
It all taps in together. So we could definitely see that things like the Metaverse and those very big projects like the likes of Decentraland, or even games like Fortnite or like, Minecraft, but actually have virtual land that you can now buy and invest in, could also be seen as the different sorts of virtual city that people are literally building and a community growing up around that. Although it should be noted that there's probably a split there too in terms of what part of the metaverse is quite centralized and coming from the world view of gaming, and what part of the metaverse is more decentralized and coming with the world view of crypto. Because those are two very different ideological communities. Games pay quite a lot for those virtual walls, actually for a safe space within which to play. Whereas the decentralized sort of community that's getting involved with literal projects like Decentraland, the clue's right there in the name, are seeing this in a much more sort of decentralized manner. So that's going to be interesting to see how the turf wars or the future geopolitics or real politic of the metaverse, as these very different worldviews that value things like freedom and safety very, very differently, are bound to clash. And we're starting to see that specifically with the gaming communities, which are just as big as the crypto communities, but have a very different set of values and are in this space for a very different set of reasons. And they are essentially starting what we could actually see as being political movements to push back against, as they sort of see them, these sort of decentralized colonists that are coming in to monetize spaces that were purely for fun. And some of the sort of clues we can see there is that gamers are now rumored to be starting gamer unions. They say if you're going to force us to work, if you're going to force us to be part of this sort of play to earn whole demographic, then we want to be treated as workers, much like gig workers are. So if we thought that gig workers were like the first pushback against our sort of social contracts and how employees and employers work together, well, we're going to start to see the same thing about gamers. If they're not playing, if they're now earning, then are they not seen as some sort of a worker in this new digital city? So it's going to be very interesting to see how those sort of masters and servants and employee and employer and politician and citizen sort of dynamics play out in the virtual space too.
Are you betting on any of these projects to succeed?
I've just started a startup. It's a company called Metanomic. And what we are doing is we are building a platform to actually connect gaming communities to each other and to approach that play and earn gaming space in a slightly different way, in a less sort of colonial way, in a more sort of emergent way. And one of the projects that we're working on there is a game called Hyperspace, which is sort of putting some of these new socio-political, economic ideas to test. So essentially our game we're seeing is almost a simulated economy that could be designed to test out some of these ideas and to see how they work out.
So on to your second key trend, and that is called DIY cities, hacking democracy, citizen shadow governments. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, this trend of hacking democracy or setting up of shadow governments could almost be seen as sort of vigilante citizenship or civics going back to the people. And here we are really talking about, again, there's various different projects we can look at, but it's where citizens see that they are simply not getting service delivery from their elected officials or for their governments or from their municipalities, are literally just taking it upon themselves to take back those services. So on a very local basis, we have seen a few municipalities here in South Africa actually win legal court interdicts to actually claw back the management of their own municipalities from their municipalities. So in other words, those municipalities are now almost being run as a body corporate, where the citizens collect their own rates and taxes and deliver their own services, bypassing the municipalities that are supposed to do that but weren't doing that. Now, that's, of course, once that sort of erosion has taken place quite a lot, but there are also movements in much more developed nations that might appear superficially to be run a lot better. And here the term shadow government is being used a lot more. And we're talking about this as being almost a way for citizens and for perhaps future political parties to start getting involved with politics that kind of bypasses the ballot box and the existing bureaucracy that has been set up around service delivery. And what shadow governments do are, again, grassroots movements, unelected individuals, concerned citizens, getting together, stepping up and doing what government's supposed to be doing. So if they see, say, a pothole in a road, these sort of shadow governments will just go and fill it. They'll do some fundraising, start up an organization and go fill it. And we do see a lot of these civil service sort of movements here in South Africa too, but the shadow government thing is almost more emergent. And what we see is people that are good at organizing can actually get up and do that. So you could almost see that again as being kind of a citizens union that gets together, collects dues, and then does works. And it could be a way to sort of start getting into government if you just do this without waiting for permission, starting a political party, buying the t-shirts like you normally do if you're going to start this. Instead, you start by doing works. You prove yourself. And then when elections roll around, you've delivered things that the people that are being paid to deliver it have not done. You're going to be in a much better position to actually take over that municipality legally using the democratic means. So we are seeing that. But there are also think tanks that are looking at this from a sort of third direction. And are actually saying that now that we have decentralized technologies that allow us to organize people at scale by using technologies very similar to the ones that are used to govern DAOs, for example, we are now able to allow citizens to make more decisions for themselves, particularly at the local government's sort of area, right? Where you have that sphere of influence where you actually care about how your verges look or whether your traffic lights are working. So the municipal government is a good place to start testing some of these ideas. But the idea is to shift government from particularly the executive sort of wing of government from making decisions for people to actually executing the will of the people. So it's taking democracy into a much deeper level. Instead of just picking your governments and picking your elected officials, you would actually be able to vote on how money is spent or what projects are executed or who does them. And the government's role would then shift to actually just executing what the people want. Now, this sort of Swiss canton system works similar to that, but it has been quite cumbersome because you're still sort of voting physically. You're not necessarily using that sort of instant voting ability that you can have with technologies like decentralized DAOs and all the rest of it to vote on very, very small things, get a quorum and get that decision moved over. But this idea of citizens and civics taking much more interest in governance and government stepping back from decision making and falling more into an executive role is probably a trend that we can see playing out in a few years into the future as a response to these shadow governments and this sort of hacking democracy where things are simply not working anymore.
The third and final trend is called charter cities. How do these work?
Yeah, so charter cities are kind of similar to those private cities that I think we've spoken about here before. But the idea of a charter city is a city that is able to govern itself, but legally, under a slightly different set of rules and regulations to the rest of the country. Typically, charter cities have been set up maybe as sort of special trading zones. We definitely have some of those in South Africa, where perhaps your taxes or tariffs are a bit different if you set up business in that particular area. Or it could be charter cities like Hong Kong was the classic example there, that was able to be semi-self-governed under a different set of rules and regulations to mainland China. That era is obviously coming to an end, but this concept of charter cities hasn't disappeared. So it's an idea of not a fully private city, but rather a city with special privileges, which again could actually end up functioning a bit like a HaHa city, in that if you are smart, savvy, or rich enough to take advantage of the special tax codes or the special sort of laws that go around it, it could become very, very useful to you. But again, there is, of course, the question of sort of inequality. So a lot of the charter cities that are being proposed at the moment, many of them are actually being proposed for Africa, because Africa is seen as a future growth market, particularly as our demographic dividend kicks in the middle of the century. And, they're coming into these rather impoverished or still early stage developing nations, and they're generally foreign managed or foreign owned. They're implanted and imported into those communities. And the idea is to sort of attract foreign investment in an attractive sort of tax area. But again, there is a slight sort of colonial overtones that come with this taking up land and bringing your own governments and governance into those spaces. This is coming from both East and West. A lot of the sort of infrastructure development projects, a part of the Belt and Road project coming out of China, also fit into this, and also sort of more missionary Silicon Valley sort of city project ideas coming from the Western Hemisphere, all kind of end up with this weird sort of implanted idea. And these sort of utopian city projects that are being done in places that perhaps don't have the strongest governance don't necessarily have a good history. If you take a large view of history, these sort of experimental cities that lack a bit of oversight don't always go as well as Hong Kong, particularly when they are entirely privately managed and run as sort of for-profit enterprises.
Looking at local government, what strategies can they implement to do more with less for their people?
But they just do less for less. So I think that's where we're starting to see that, we have too much sort of top heavy central planning. It's not working. That most of the problems in South Africa are to do with service delivery. So it actually makes a lot more sense, given that we do have a society that's actually really good at DIYing. That's one thing South Africans do well. We provide our own security. We provide our own education. We put up our own booms. We fix our own roads. There's already a sense of sort of making a plan within our communities. And my recommendation would actually be to devolve a lot of that execution to the people.
So how will people be incentivized to do this? Or will the incentive simply be in the solution?
I think that's how we need to start, actually putting extra nodes into our sort of decentralization of our structures. We already have municipalities and we do have sort of ward councillors, but what power do those ward councillors have? Generally, they are barely compensated for their work, right? So they're doing it because they're passionate about their communities. And below them, they've all got those support structures. So how do we actually devolve power to people at the ends of the branches so they can actually start making executive decisions, because they're much closer to the people? So that would probably be the way to make sure budgets go further, is to actually allocate them further down the branches. For one, if anyone makes a mistake, that mistake is sort of contained to that small end of the tail.
Bronwyn, you read a lot of books. Do you have any book recommendations to help us navigate towards what might be lying ahead? And I'd like book recommendations, one for city officials or city leaders, a second one for business owners, and a third one simply for individuals.
I think that everybody at this point in time, given everything that I've been talking about with the private cities and the HaHa cities and the separation and the decentralizing democracy, whether you're a business or whether you are a government official or whether you're an individual, a good starting book, and it's not too long. Yes, it does involve a bit of economics and a bit of sort of academic theory, but because it's short, it's definitely worth doing. And that is, I would recommend that you read Exit, Voice and Loyalty, which really does talk about how people can work with power structures or refuse to work with them. So there's both warnings and hints at opportunity really for everyone. And depending on what role you play, you would be either inspired or slightly scared by either one of those suggestions. But it's a good idea to understand the incentives, the trade-offs, and the realities at play when we do try to look at separating ourselves from society. For business owners, I think it's definitely worth going back in time around about, 15 years, to Synthetic Worlds. Now, Synthetic Worlds was written by an economist, and he was writing about the earliest days of the emergence of the virtual economy. And he wrote about it from an economics perspective rather than from a gaming, or at that stage, cryptography didn't even exist perspective. But a lot of his insights do really relate to everything else that's going on in the world. So I would recommend that particularly business owners take cognizance of that, and some of the opportunities and some of the problems that he identified would be really quite useful for you going forward there. In terms of individuals, I think it's always good for us to think about how utopias can go wrong, particularly when we think about what sort of people to support with our vote or with our voice or whatever. And a very good book that was quite interesting over the last few months was a book called Better to Have Gone. And it's a book about the Auroville utopian community that was set up in India. Again, it had some of those overtones of evangelical, almost missionary businesses, in that it was set up by a bunch of foreign hippies, and it's still running today, but it definitely ran into some problems in both the economic and the political sphere. So I do think that that's worth looking at if you are an individual interested in the future of cities and utopias and just society in general.
Bronwyn, lastly, what key trends do you see playing out in the crypto space affecting cities this year?
Yeah, if you're looking at trends that are going on in the world of crypto, I think that NFTs are the wrong place to be looking. They're more noise than substance. And I think it's much more interesting to actually look at the deeper things that are less pretty and less exciting. I mean, NFTs are easy to talk about because they're pretty, and it's like you've got an object that you can discuss, which means the story is easier for us to absorb. But the really interesting things are taking place kind of below the surface. So on the one hand, I suspect that 2022, 2023 is definitely going to be the period of DAOs coming to the future. We had the token season in sort of 2017, 2018. We had the NFT explosion in 2020, 2021. DAOs are where we're going to start to see things really happening, and this ties in a lot to communities. So we're going to see governments, particularly local governments and also corporate governments, starting to take advantage of those abilities to actually decentralize decision-making. And the things to watch there are the different decentralized decision-making consensus protocols in play. There are different ways to come to that. And the challenge is, particularly for users of these systems, whether we are consumers or whether we are investors, is to see how that consensus is being made and if it can be gamed, if it is going to be devolving into a sort of pay-to-win scenario, or if we truly are decentralizing and democratizing, democracy within these systems and decision-making consensus. So have a look at how the protocols run, not just how pretty the front end of the websites of these various different enterprises are, and definitely try and get involved, because it is a good way to sort of understand how decisions are made and the limits really of decentralization and democracy. We're definitely going to see more of that. And at the same time, we're going to see the Leviathan raise its head in terms of regulation. It kind of has to be done. I think I've also spoken on the show. I've definitely spoken extensively about these issues before, in that decentralized protocols, whether they are currencies or whether they are DAOs, are fundamentally destabilizing. Now, depending on your political leanings and personality type, you might think that sort of destabilizing and danger is lots of fun, or it could be very, very scary. And you kind of have to understand both of those points of view, because we have to live in society and not everybody wants what everybody else wants. And to that end, our social contracts in terms of our physical and physical safety and our physical and physical entitlements that we get out of sort of giving up some of our freedoms are premised on nation-state control and borders. Really, the limits of any sort of power and societal sort of safety and structure are dependent on how firmly those borders are governed, whether that border is a HaHa or a wall or a capital exchange protocol. The borders are what keep us safe and keep us together. They keep us in and they keep outsiders out. And we really have to watch those borderlands, because that's where things are going to get really, really interesting from a regulatory point of view, because physical borders need to be defended as much as physical borders need to be defended in order to maintain law and order. Whether you want law and order, whether you're into sort of defunding the police or you're into actually ramping up law and order, I'll leave that up to you to decide. But we're going to see regulators essentially going to war around those borderlands to sort of defend the current social contract and to perhaps fight to break it down. So we're going to see that. And the other one to look out for is the real deep battle that's going to start taking place around central bank digital currencies, which offer a really different degree of control and power to regulators. They should not be confused with decentralized protocols at all. In fact, they don't even need to use a blockchain. But the principle that we're going to see is that essentially governments get closer to individuals and cut out a lot of middlemen. Now, on the one hand, governments getting closer to individuals, like we've spoken about in terms of the city and in terms of governance, that's probably a good thing. We have probably too much bureaucracy getting in the way of actually executing on service delivery for taxpayers and for citizens within communities. But when it comes to finance, there are rather good reasons to actually have some buffer between central governments and central banks and the citizens that they serve, simply because humans are humans and temptations around money work slightly differently to temptations around government. So it's something we really should be aware of, and I would definitely encourage everyone to look up what is going on with central bank digital currencies and how they differ from decentralization. And of course, just understand that the one is really all about the opposite of decentralization. And draw your own battle lines, make your own decisions about which of these worldviews you support. But you do have to realize that there is quite a big trend and counter trend with regards to centrifugal and centripetal forces going on around now. And hopefully, best case scenario, we end up with a compromise, because either extreme is going to leave a lot of people out in the proverbial and perhaps even literal cold.